The mist hung low over the mountain that morning, wrapping around the trees like a gentle shroud. Dr. Margaret Hayes stood at her kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She wasn't drinking it anyway. Her attention was fixed on the small spotted form curled up on her wooden porch, exactly where she'd found him for the 10th morning in a row. The leopard cub couldn't have been more than 3 months old. His rosettes were still fuzzy around the edges, that distinctive baby softness that would sharpen into the sleek patterns of an adult leopard within the year. If he survived that long, Margaret knew the statistics by heart. Without a mother, a cub this young had perhaps a 5% chance of making it through the next month. The rational part of her brain, the part trained by 3 decades of wildlife veterinary work, screamed at her to call the park rangers. Let them handle it. Don't interfere. Those were the rules she'd lived by, the rules she'd taught countless junior vets and volunteers over the years. But something about this particular cub made her hesitate. It wasn't just that he was orphaned, though that tugged at her heart in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. It was the way he looked at her, not with the wild fear she'd expect from a leopard encountering a human, but with something that looked impossibly like recognition, like hope. Margaret set down her coffee cup and moved slowly toward the door. The cub's ear twitched at the sound of her footsteps, but he didn't run. He hadn't run since that first morning when she'd startled him by opening the door too quickly. Now he simply watched her approach through half-lidded eyes, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. She'd been living at the edge of the national park for 2 years now, ever since her retirement. The cabin had been a gift to herself, a place to decompress after decades of emergency surgeries, midnight calls about injured elephants, and the constant emotional toll of watching magnificent creatures suffer. She'd thought she wanted solitude. After her husband David's death 5 years ago, after her daughter Emma had moved to Australia with her family, Margaret had convinced herself that being alone was what she needed. Time to read, to paint, to simply exist without the weight of other lives depending on her. The universe, it seemed, had other plans. The cub had first appeared exactly 10 days ago. Margaret remembered it clearly because it was a Tuesday, and she'd just finished her weekly video call with Emma and the grandchildren. She'd been feeling particularly lonely, the way she always did after seeing her family's faces pixelated on a computer screen, close enough to see but too far to touch. She'd gone to the porch to watch the sunrise, hoping the beauty of the mountains might ease the ache in her chest, and there he was. At first, she thought she was hallucinating. Leopards were notoriously elusive, and while she knew they lived in the park, actually seeing one near human habitation was extraordinarily rare. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim morning light, there was no denying what lay before her. A leopard cub, far too young to be alone, curled into a tight ball against the far corner of her porch. Her first instinct had been professional. Check for injuries, assess body condition, look for signs of disease. But as she'd moved closer, the cub had opened his eyes, and something in that amber gaze had stopped her cold. He wasn't afraid. He was exhausted, certainly, probably hungry, but not afraid. It was as if he'd chosen her porch deliberately, as if he knew exactly where he was. That first day, she'd done nothing but observe. The cub had stayed on the porch for 3 hours, sleeping fitfully, occasionally opening his eyes to check if she was still watching through the window. When he finally left, disappearing into the bush with a slight limp, she noted with professional concern, Margaret had been certain she'd never see him again. But he came back the next morning, and the next, and every morning since. By the 4th day, she'd broken her first rule. She'd left a bowl of water on the porch. Not food, she'd reasoned with herself. Just water. Hydration was critical for survival. And what harm could water do? The cub had drunk deeply, his small pink tongue lapping at the bowl while keeping one wary eye on the window where Margaret stood watching. By the 7th day, she'd broken her second rule. She'd spoken to him. Just a soft, "Good morning, little one," through the closed door, but the cub's ears had swiveled toward her voice, and he'd made a small sound in response. Not quite a purr, not quite a mew, but something in between that had made Margaret's throat tight with unexpected emotion. Now, on the 10th day, she was about to break her third and most important rule. Margaret opened the door slowly, carefully. The cub lifted his head, but didn't flee. She could see him more clearly now, and her trained eye cataloged concerning details. He was thin, too thin. His fur had lost some of its luster. The limp was more pronounced. Whatever had happened to his mother, this cub was slowly starving. She sat down on the porch, maintaining a respectful distance. The wooden boards were cold through her jeans, still damp with morning dew. The cub watched her with those extraordinary eyes, and Margaret found herself talking, her voice low and steady. "You know I can't feed you," she said. "That's the cardinal rule. Feed a wild animal, and you sign his death warrant. You'll become dependent, lose your hunting instincts, approach other humans who won't be as kind." She sighed. "I've given that speech 100 times. Maybe more." The cub blinked slowly, a gesture that in domestic cats signaled trust and comfort. Margaret found herself blinking slowly back, feeling slightly ridiculous but unable to stop herself. "The thing is," she continued, "you're going to die anyway, aren't you? Without your mother, without pride protection, you've got maybe a week. Probably less." Her voice caught slightly. "I've seen it too many times. Cubs wandering alone, getting weaker each day, until—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The sun was rising higher now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink. Birds were beginning their morning chorus, and somewhere in the distance, Margaret could hear the distinctive call of a fish eagle. The cub shifted slightly, moving just a fraction closer to where she sat. "I had a daughter once," Margaret said, surprising herself with the admission. "Still do, of course. She's just far away. She has her own cubs now. 3 of them. They call me Nana over video calls, but I've only held the youngest once." She laughed softly, without humor. "Listen to me, comparing human families to leopards. David would have said, 'I'm getting sentimental in my old age.'" The cub made that small sound again, and this time, Margaret was certain it was meant as communication. She'd heard similar sounds from leopard cubs with their mothers, a vocalization that meant something like, "I'm here. Are you there?" "I'm here," she whispered back. They sat together in silence for several minutes, an old woman and a dying cub, watching the world wake up around them. Margaret's mind was racing, cycling through possibilities, probabilities, ethics, and emotions. She knew what she should do. She also knew what she wanted to do. The two were diametrically opposed. Finally, the cub stood. Margaret expected him to leave as he had every other morning, melting back into the bush to face another day of unsuccessful hunting and gradual starvation. Instead, he took 3 small, wobbly steps toward her. Margaret's breath caught. In 32 years of working with wildlife, she'd never had a truly wild animal approach her voluntarily, without food as enticement. Her rational brain provided explanations. The cub was desperate, confused, possibly neurologically impaired from malnutrition. But her heart whispered something different. The cub was choosing her. He stopped just outside of arm's reach, those amber eyes fixed on her face. Then, with apparent effort, he lay down again, this time facing her directly. The trust in that simple action was devastating. "Oh, little one," Margaret breathed, "what am I going to do with you?" As if in answer, the cub's stomach growled audibly. The sound was so prosaic, so absolutely ordinary, that Margaret found herself laughing even as tears pricked her eyes. Here was this magnificent wild creature, and his stomach growled just like any hungry baby's would. She stood slowly, her knees protesting the movement. The cub tensed but didn't flee. "Wait here," she said, knowing he couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. "I'll be right back." Inside her cabin, Margaret stood in front of her refrigerator, paralyzed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. She had some chicken in the freezer, bought for her own dinners. In the field, she'd often seen cubs feeding on birds when they couldn't manage larger prey. It wasn't ideal nutrition for a leopard, but it was better than nothing. Her hands shook slightly as she defrosted a small portion in the microwave. Not from age, though at 68 she was entitled to a tremor or two, but from the weight of the decision. She was about to cross a line she'd never crossed before. Once she fed this cub, everything would change. When she returned to the porch, The cub was exactly where she'd left him. The trust in that simple fact nearly undid her. She placed the plate of chicken pieces a few feet from where he lay, then retreated to sit by her door. The cub approached the food cautiously, sniffing delicately before taking a small piece in his mouth. The transformation was immediate. His whole body seemed to vibrate with desperate hunger, and he devoured the chicken with an intensity that confirmed Margaret's suspicions about how long it had been since his last meal. Slowly, she cautioned, though she knew he wouldn't listen. "You'll make yourself sick if you eat too fast." When the plate was empty, the cub licked it clean, then looked at her with such naked hope that Margaret's carefully constructed professional detachment crumbled entirely. "Tomorrow," she promised. "Same time." The cub seemed to understand. He walked back to his spot on the porch, circled 3 times like a domestic dog, and settled down for what appeared to be the first peaceful sleep he'd had in days. Margaret watched him for a long time, this small spotted miracle who had chosen her porch as his sanctuary. She thought about the rules she'd lived by, the scientific principles that governed wildlife rehabilitation, the ethical guidelines that strictly forbade what she'd just done. Then she thought about David, who would have understood. About Emma, so far away with her own babies to protect. About the vast loneliness of her retirement, which she'd convinced herself was peaceful solitude, but which sometimes felt like a slow disappearance from the world. The cub's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of true sleep. One of his paws twitched, perhaps dreaming of his mother, of a time when the world was safe and milk was plentiful and survival wasn't a daily question mark. Margaret made a decision. She went inside and pulled out her old veterinary bag, the one she'd sworn she'd never need again. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it right. The cub needed a proper examination, vaccinations if she could manage them, treatment for whatever was causing that limp. She'd need to contact her old colleague, James, who still worked at the park's veterinary center. He'd be horrified by what she was doing, but he'd help. He always had. Over the next hours, as the cub slept on her porch, Margaret planned. She made lists of supplies she'd need, nutrition protocols for orphan leopard cubs, exercises to maintain hunting instincts even with supplemental feeding. She pulled out her old textbooks, refreshing her memory on leopard development, behavior, and biology. If she was going to break the rules, she'd break them with precision and purpose. The sun was high overhead when the cub finally stirred. He stretched luxuriously, a normal cat-like movement that made Margaret smile. Then he looked directly at her through the window and made that small sound again. "I'm here, are you there?" "I'm here," she said through the glass. "I'm not going anywhere." The cub stood, shook himself, and padded to the edge of the porch. He paused there, looking back at her once more, and Margaret could have sworn she saw something like gratitude in those amber eyes. Then he was gone, disappearing into the dappled shadows of the forest with a grace that belied his weakened condition. Margaret stood at the window for a long time after he left, wondering what she'd started. She'd broken the cardinal rule of wildlife interaction. She'd potentially doomed this cub to a life of dependency, robbed him of his wild nature, inserted herself into a natural process that should have proceeded without human interference. Or had she? Because what she'd seen in the cub's eyes wasn't the dull acceptance of captivity or the calculating opportunism of an animal exploiting human kindness. It was something else entirely. A recognition, perhaps, that sometimes survival requires adapting the rules. That sometimes, just sometimes, 2 lost souls could find each other across the vast divide of species and create something new. Not quite wild, not quite tame, but something uniquely their own. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the African night, the distant roar of a lion, the cackling of hyenas, the symphony of insects and night birds. Somewhere out there, her cub was navigating his dangerous world. She'd given him one good meal, but would it be enough? Would he return in the morning, or had she imagined the connection between them? At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and made herself tea. She sat at her kitchen table, looking through photo albums she hadn't opened in years. Pictures of David, vibrant and laughing, before the cancer. Pictures of Emma as a child, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a rescued rabbit they'd nursed back to health together. Pictures of herself, younger, surrounded by colleagues at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, all of them covered in mud and grinning after successfully treating an injured rhino. She'd had a full life, a good life, but these last 2 years of self-imposed isolation had drained something essential from her. She thought she was protecting herself from further loss, but instead, she'd been slowly disappearing, becoming as ghostly as the mist that rolled down from the mountains each morning. The cub had changed that. In just 10 days, this small, spotted survivor had given her something she hadn't even realized she'd lost: purpose. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in layers of purple and orange. Margaret was on the porch with her coffee, a plate of carefully prepared chicken and supplements waiting on the small table beside her. She'd added calcium and taurine, essential nutrients for a growing leopard. It wasn't a complete diet, but it would help. 6 o'clock came and went. Then 6:30. By 7, Margaret's hope was fading. Perhaps yesterday had been too much. Perhaps the cub had decided that human interaction, even with food as incentive, wasn't worth the risk. Then she saw him. He was moving differently today, more confident despite the limp. He emerged from the tree line with his head high, those amber eyes immediately finding her on the porch. He approached without hesitation, and Margaret's heart swelled with relief and something deeper, something she wasn't quite ready to name. "Good morning, little one," she said softly. The cub responded with a proper vocalization this time, a small roar that was probably meant to be fierce, but came out endearingly squeaky. Margaret laughed, a real laugh, the first in months. She placed the food closer to herself this time, testing boundaries. The cub approached and ate with less desperation than yesterday, pausing occasionally to look at her. When he finished, instead of retreating to the far corner of the porch, he settled just a few feet from where she sat. "Progress," Margaret murmured. They spent the morning in companionable silence, the old woman reading a book while the young leopard dozed in the warming sun. Occasionally, Margaret would glance over to find the cub watching her, those intelligent eyes tracking her movements with interest rather than wariness. On the 12th day, the cub allowed her to examine his injured leg. It was a revelation of trust that left Margaret breathless. She moved slowly, telegraphing every movement, her hands gentle and sure despite their slight tremor. The injury wasn't as bad as she'd feared, a deep scratch that had become slightly infected but was already beginning to heal with proper nutrition boosting his immune system. "You're going to be fine," she told him, applying antibiotic cream with a careful touch. The cub endured the treatment with remarkable patience, only flinching once when she cleaned the deepest part of the wound. By the 15th day, a routine had established itself. The cub would arrive at dawn, eat his carefully prepared meal, then spend the morning on the porch while Margaret went about her day. Sometimes she'd read to him, feeling only slightly foolish as she shared passages from her favorite books. The cub seemed to enjoy the sound of her voice, his ears swiveling to track her even when his eyes were closed. On the 20th day, everything changed. Margaret was preparing the morning meal when she heard it, a deep, rumbling growl that was definitely not from her small cub. She froze, her hand still on the cutting board, and looked out the window. An adult female leopard stood at the edge of her property, her powerful body tense with threat. Margaret's cub was on the porch, but instead of cowering, he was standing tall, his small body positioned between the adult leopard and the door to Margaret's cabin. He was protecting her. This cub, barely 3 months old, was standing against an adult leopard to protect a human who had shown him kindness. It defied every principle of animal behavior Margaret had studied. It should have been impossible. The adult leopard made another warning sound, and Margaret's heart raced. If the larger cat decided to attack, the cub wouldn't stand chance. Neither would Margaret if she tried to intervene. But then something extraordinary happened. The cub vocalized, a series of sounds Margaret had never heard before, almost conversational in their cadence. The adult leopard's posture shifted slightly, her head tilting as if confused. The cub continued his vocalization, and impossibly, the tension began to ease. The adult leopard sat down. Margaret hardly dared to breathe as the two cats continued their apparent conversation. The cub's voice was high and insistent, while the adult's responses were lower, almost querulous. It went on for several minutes, and then the adult leopard stood, gave Margaret's cabin one long, assessing look, and melted back into the forest. The cub turned to look at Margaret through the window, and she could have sworn he looked proud of himself. "What just happened?" she whispered. The cub, of course, didn't answer. He simply returned to his favorite spot on the porch and settled down for his morning nap, as if he hadn't just faced down a full-grown leopard in defense of a human. That evening, Margaret called James. "I need to tell you something," she said without preamble when he answered. "And I need you to listen without judgment until I'm finished." She told him everything. The cub's first appearance, her breaking of every protocol she'd once held sacred, the growing bond between them, and the morning's confrontation with the adult leopard. James listened in silence, and Margaret could picture his expression growing more incredulous with each detail. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice careful, "you know this is impossible, inadvisable, completely against everything we've ever been taught." "Yes, I know all of that. I was going to say remarkable," James said quietly. "In 40 years of working with wildlife, I've never heard of anything like this." They talked for over an hour, James's initial concern giving way to scientific fascination. He agreed to help, to provide proper nutritional supplements and medical supplies through unofficial channels. He also agreed to keep Margaret's secret, at least for now. "But Margaret," he said before hanging up, "you know this can't last forever. That cub will grow. He'll become dangerous, no matter how bonded you are now." "I know," Margaret said, though the thought made her chest tight. "But right now, he needs me. And if I'm honest, I need him too." The weeks that followed took on a dreamlike quality. The cub, whom Margaret had begun calling Mwezi, the Swahili word for moon, grew stronger and more confident. His limp disappeared entirely, and his coat regained its healthy shine. He began to explore wider territories during his daily absences, but always returned to Margaret's porch each dawn. More remarkably, he began to bridge two worlds in ways Margaret had never imagined possible. He learned to hunt, initially bringing her small prey with the obvious pride of a house cat presenting a gift. Margaret praised him lavishly, understanding that this was crucial for his survival, even as it meant he was maintaining his wild instincts despite their daily interaction. He also began to display behaviors that were distinctly domesticated. He would purr, a sound Margaret had never heard from a wild leopard, when she spoke to him. He learned to play, batting at a rope toy she'd fashioned, though always with claws carefully sheathed. Most remarkably, he began to escort her on her walks, maintaining a respectful distance, but always keeping her in sight, as if he'd appointed himself her guardian. 3 months into their unlikely friendship, Margaret faced a crisis. She developed a severe respiratory infection, probably caught during her last trip to town for supplies. For 3 days, she was too sick to leave her bed, too weak even to prepare Mwezi's meals. On the morning of the 4th day, she dragged herself to the door, expecting to find no sign of the cub. Surely, he would have given up and moved on when she failed to appear with food. Instead, she found him curled up against her door, as if he'd been keeping vigil. When he saw her, he made a sound she'd never heard before, a soft, concerned churring that sounded almost like a question. "I'm okay, little one," she croaked, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Mwezi stood and rubbed against her legs, a gesture so cat-like and affectionate that tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. Then he did something that defied every law of wild animal behavior. He followed her into the cabin. Margaret was too exhausted to protest. She collapsed on her couch, and Mwezi, after a brief exploration of this new environment, settled on the floor beside her. He stayed there for hours, leaving only once to hunt, returning with a small antelope which he left on her porch like an offering. "You're trying to feed me," Margaret realized, touched beyond words. "You're taking care of me." That night, for the first and only time, Mwezi slept inside. He positioned himself by the door, alert to every sound, a spotted guardian angel that by all rights shouldn't exist. Margaret slept better than she had in months, knowing she was protected. By morning, her fever had broken. She managed to prepare a proper meal for both of them and gently encouraged Mwezi back outside. He went willingly enough, seeming to understand that the indoor sojourn had been an exception, not a new rule. "We're quite the pair, aren't we?" Margaret said, watching him stretch in the morning sun. The veterinarian who forgot the rules and the leopard who rewrote them. As Mwezi grew, so did his reputation in the area. Other leopards gave Margaret's property a wide berth, as did the occasional hyena or wild dog pack that ventured too close. It was as if word had spread through the animal kingdom that this particular human was under protection. The local bird population, however, seemed to understand that Mwezi posed no threat to them when he was on the porch. They would often feed just meters from where he lay, and Margaret sometimes caught him watching them with what looked like amusement rather than predatory interest. 6 months into their arrangement, James paid a visit. He approached cautiously, having heard stories but needing to see for himself. Mwezi, now significantly larger and bearing the sleek muscles of a young adult leopard, watched from the porch with obvious suspicion. "It's all right, Mwezi," Margaret said calmly. "James is a friend." The leopard relaxed marginally but kept his amber eyes fixed on the visitor. James stood frozen at the edge of the property, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Margaret, he's magnificent. And he's actually listening to you." "We listen to each other," Margaret corrected gently. James stayed for several hours, observing the interaction between woman and leopard with the trained eye of a wildlife veterinarian. He took discreet photos and notes, muttering occasionally about publishing a paper that would revolutionize understanding of human-wildlife bonding. "No papers," Margaret said firmly. "This needs to remain private. For Mwezi's safety." James reluctantly agreed, but not before performing a basic health check on Mwezi, who tolerated the examination with remarkable patience. "He's in perfect health," James announced. "Actually, better than perfect. His muscle development is superior to most wild leopards his age, probably because of the consistent nutrition. And his coat." He shook his head in amazement. "Margaret, he's thriving." That evening, after James had left, Margaret sat on her porch with Mwezi beside her, closer than he'd ever positioned himself before. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "He's right, you know," she told the leopard. "You should be wild. Completely wild. What we have, it shouldn't be possible." Mwezi turned his great head to look at her, and in those amber eyes, Margaret saw something that transcended the typical boundaries of human and animal understanding. It wasn't domestication. Mwezi was still wild, still a leopard in every way that mattered. But he had chosen to expand his world to include her, to create a bridge between two species that conventional wisdom said could never truly connect. The rains came early that year, transforming the landscape into a lush paradise. Mwezi's visits became slightly less predictable as prey became more abundant, and he expanded his territory. Sometimes he'd be gone for 2 or 3 days, and Margaret would worry, pacing her porch and straining her ears for any sound of his return. He always came back. On one particularly stormy night, Margaret was awakened by a sound she'd never heard before. Mwezi's voice, urgent and insistent, just outside her door. She opened it to find him soaking wet and agitated, pacing back and forth. "What is it, boy? What's wrong?" He vocalized again, then moved toward the forest, looking back at her expectantly. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed a flashlight and her emergency medical kit, following the leopard into the storm. They moved through the forest for nearly 20 minutes, Mwezi constantly checking to ensure she was keeping up, until they reached a small clearing. There, huddled against a fallen tree, was another leopard cub. This one was even younger than Mwezi had been when he first appeared, probably no more than 6 weeks old. "Oh, little one," Margaret breathed, immediately assessing the situation. The cub was hypothermic, barely responsive. There was no sign of its mother. She bundled the tiny creature into her jacket and turned to Mwezi. We need to get back. Now. The journey back to the cabin was treacherous in the storm, but Mwezi led her unerringly, choosing the safest paths, warning her with small sounds when the terrain was particularly difficult. Back in the cabin, Margaret worked with desperate efficiency. She warmed the cub gradually, administered fluids, checked for injuries. Mwezi watched every movement, occasionally making soft, encouraging sounds to the barely conscious cub. It took 3 hours, but finally, the little one's eyes opened. They were blue, as all leopard cubs' eyes are at that age, unfocused but alive. You did it, Mwezi, Margaret said, exhausted but exhilarated. You saved this baby. Mwezi approached the cub slowly, sniffing it carefully, then began to groom it with a gentleness that took Margaret's breath away. This adolescent leopard, who should have seen the cub as potential competition or even prey, was caring for it like a sibling. The cub, whom Margaret named Duma, became a part of their unusual family. Unlike Mwezi, who maintained his independence, Duma was more traditionally orphaned, requiring round-the-clock care. Mwezi appointed himself as assistant caregiver, often curling around the tiny cub on the porch, keeping it warm and protected. Watching them together, Margaret was struck by the realization that she wasn't just witnessing unusual animal behavior. She was seeing the evolution of something entirely new, a cross-species family unit that operated on principles of trust, care, and mutual protection. James, when told about Duma, was beyond skeptical. Margaret, you're creating a situation that's completely unsustainable. What happens when they're both fully grown? What happens when their territorial instincts kick in? But months passed, and the dreaded territorial disputes never materialized. Mwezi seemed to understand that Duma was under Margaret's care, and later, as Duma grew stronger and began to explore, Mwezi took on the role of mentor, teaching the younger cat hunting techniques and forest navigation. Margaret documented everything meticulously, filling journals with observations that challenged every established principle of leopard behavior. She watched Mwezi teach Duma to hunt using the rope toy as a training tool. She observed them sharing kills, something adult leopards simply didn't do. She recorded their vocalizations, noting the development of what seemed to be specific calls that meant specific things. 1 year after Mwezi's first appearance, Margaret received unexpected news. Emma was coming to visit with her family. "Mom, I'm worried about you all alone out there," Emma had said during their video call. "The kids miss you." "We all do." Margaret was thrilled and terrified in equal measure. How would she explain Mwezi and Duma? How would the leopards react to strangers, especially children? She spent weeks preparing, both practically and psychologically. She increased the distance of her interactions with both leopards, encouraging them to spend more time in the forest. She spoke to them constantly about the upcoming visit, knowing they couldn't understand the words, but hoping they might sense the importance in her tone. The day Emma's rental car pulled up to the cabin, both leopards were nowhere to be seen. Margaret was both relieved and oddly disappointed. The reunion was everything Margaret had hoped for. Her grandchildren, now 5, 7, and 9, exploded from the car in a tornado of excitement and chatter. Emma, looking tired from the long journey but radiant with happiness, enveloped her mother in a hug that lasted so long Margaret felt years of loneliness dissolving. "Mom, you look amazing," Emma said, pulling back to study her mother's face. "When we last video called, you seemed so, withdrawn, but now you're glowing." Margaret smiled, thinking of her spotted guardians. "I've found some new purpose," she said simply. The first 2 days of the visit were perfect. The children explored the area around the cabin, always under watchful adult eyes. They spotted various antelopes, birds, and even a distant elephant herd. Emma relaxed visibly, seeing her mother so engaged and alive. On the third morning, Margaret woke to find Mwezi on the porch. Her heart raced. The children were still asleep, but they'd be up soon. She slipped outside, closing the door carefully behind her. "You can't be here right now," she whispered urgently. "I know you don't understand, but please, you need to go." Mwezi looked at her with those intelligent amber eyes, then looked pointedly at the door. Yes, my family is here. My human family. And they won't understand about you. The leopard made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and began to leave. Then the door opened behind Margaret. Nana, who are you talking to? Oh my God. 7-year-old Lucas stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide as saucers as he stared at Mwezi. Margaret's mind raced. Lucas, sweetheart, don't move. Don't make any sudden. Is that your leopard? Lucas whispered, all replacing fear in his voice. He's beautiful. Mwezi had frozen too, assessing this new small human. Margaret held her breath. Then Lucas did something that would have given any wildlife expert a heart attack. He sat down, right there in the doorway, and extended his hand slowly toward Mwezi. Lucas, no. Margaret started, but stopped as she saw Mwezi's reaction. The leopard took 2 careful steps forward and sniffed Lucas's outstretched hand. Then, to Margaret's amazement, he rubbed his great head against the boy's palm, purring audibly. Mom! Emma's voice came from inside, followed by her appearance in the doorway. The scream that followed could probably be heard at the park headquarters. What followed was perhaps the most surreal morning of Margaret's life. After the initial panic, after Emma had been convinced not to call the authorities, after extensive explanation and demonstration of Mwezi's gentleness, the entire family found themselves sitting on the porch with a leopard. Mwezi, for his part, seemed to understand that these humans were important to Margaret. He was patient with the children's excitement, tolerant of their questions and their tentative touches. When little Sophie, the 5-year-old, accidentally pulled his tail, he simply turned and licked her hand, making her giggle. This is impossible, Emma kept saying, her scientist training warring with the evidence of her eyes. Leopards don't do this. They can't do this. And yet, Margaret said, watching her grandchildren play a gentle game of tug-of-war with Mwezi using the old rope toy. When Duma appeared an hour later, smaller and shyer, the children were beside themselves with joy. The younger leopard was more cautious, but eventually allowed Lucas to stroke his back while he ate. You've created something extraordinary here, Mom, Emma said that evening, after the leopards had retreated to the forest and the children were in bed. I mean, it goes against everything I learned in biology, everything you taught me about wildlife. But seeing it, I know it's unconventional, Margaret began. It's magical, Emma interrupted. The kids will remember this for the rest of their lives. And you, Mom, I haven't seen you this alive since before Dad died. They talked late into the night, about loss and loneliness, about the unexpected paths life takes, about the family we're born into and the family we choose. Or sometimes, the family that chooses us. The rest of the visit was a blur of wonder. The children spent hours with the leopards, always supervised, always respectful of boundaries. Mwezi seemed particularly taken with Lucas, often positioning himself as the boy's special guardian. Duma preferred Sophie, who would sing to him in her high, sweet voice. Emma documented everything with photos and videos, creating a record of something that shouldn't exist but did. On their last day, as they were packing the car, both leopards appeared as if to say goodbye. Will we see them again, Nana? Lucas asked, tears streaming down his face as he hugged Mwezi one last time. I hope so, sweetheart, Margaret said, though she wondered if this perfect visit hadn't been a one-time miracle. After her family left, Margaret expected things to return to their previous routine. But Mwezi and Duma seemed restless, often looking down the road where the car had disappeared. They had tasted a larger family unit and seemed to miss it. 2 months later, Margaret received a video call from Emma. Mom, you're not going to believe this, but Lucas has started a presentation for his school science fair. It's about interspecies bonding. He wants to know if he can use the photos and videos of Mwezi and Duma. Margaret hesitated. Exposure could be dangerous for the leopards. But looking at Lucas's eager face on the screen, she couldn't say no. Just for the school, she said. No social media, no wide distribution. Lucas's presentation was a sensation. His teacher, initially skeptical, was convinced by the video evidence and Emma's scientific credentials. The project won first place and attracted the attention of a wildlife documentary filmmaker who happened to have a child at the school. Mrs. Hayes, the filmmaker said when he called Margaret, "What you've achieved is unprecedented. I'd like to document it properly. Not for sensation, but for science. This could change how we understand human-animal relationships." Margaret refused initially, but James convinced her to at least meet with the filmmaker. Michael turned out to be thoughtful and respectful, more interested in the science than the spectacle. "I won't do anything that endangers them," Margaret said firmly. "Neither would I," Michael assured her. "This is about showing the world that the boundaries we've drawn between human and wild might be more fluid than we thought." The filming took place over several months, with Michael and a small crew documenting the daily interactions between Margaret and the leopards. What started as a scientific documentary evolved into something more, a meditation on loneliness, connection, and the families we create when traditional structures fail us. During the filming, something remarkable happened. Duma, now approaching adolescence, brought home a female leopard. She was young, probably from a neighboring territory, and initially extremely wary. But over several weeks, encouraged by Duma and tolerated by Mwezi, she began to approach the cabin. "You're matchmaking now?" Margaret asked Duma, who seemed immensely proud of himself. The female, whom Margaret named Kasai, never became as comfortable with human interaction as Mwezi and Duma. But she would rest at the edge of the property while the males visited Margaret, and occasionally she would accept food from a distance. "You're witnessing the formation of an entirely new social structure," Michael said one day, reviewing his footage. "Leopards don't form groups. They don't share territories. They certainly don't adopt human protectors. Yet here we are." The documentary, when it was released, caused a sensation in the wildlife biology community. Some experts dismissed it as an anomaly, a dangerous precedent that could encourage people to interfere with wild animals. Others saw it as evidence that animal behavior was far more complex and adaptable than previously understood. Margaret found herself at the center of a debate she'd never intended to start. She received letters from around the world, some praising her for her compassion, others condemning her for violating the sacred boundary between wild and domestic. Through it all, Mwezi and Duma continued their daily visits. Kasai gave birth to 2 cubs, and to everyone's amazement, she brought them to Margaret's porch when they were 6 weeks old, as if presenting them for approval. "She's trusting you with her babies," James said, witnessing this. "In 40 years of studying leopards, I've never—" "Margaret, you've become part of their social structure. You're not their owner or their keeper. You're family." The cubs, playful and bold, treated Margaret's porch as a playground. Mwezi and Duma took turns watching them, displaying a cooperative care that defied every model of leopard behavior. One evening, as Margaret sat surrounded by 3 adult leopards and 2 cubs, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a lonely widow at the edge of the wilderness to the matriarch of the most unusual family imaginable. "You saved me," she told Mwezi, who was lying beside her, his great head resting on his paws. "That first day, when you showed up on my porch, I was disappearing. I had no purpose, no connection to anything. You gave me back my life." Mwezi opened one eye and made that familiar sound, the one that had evolved from a simple vocalization to something that meant, unmistakably, "I love you. I love you too, my friend." 2 years passed. The cubs grew strong and independent, though they never strayed far from Margaret's property. Other leopards began to appear at the edges, curious about this strange colony that had formed around human dwelling. Some stayed, some moved on, but all seemed to understand that this was a place of safety, a neutral ground where the usual rules didn't apply. Emma and the children visited twice a year, each time strengthening the bonds between human and leopard families. Lucas, now 10, had become something of a celebrity at his school, the boy who played with leopards. But more importantly, He developed a deep passion for conservation and wildlife biology. "I want to be like Nana," he told Margaret during one visit. "I want to understand animals the way you do." "I don't understand them," Margaret corrected gently, watching Mwezi teaching Sophie how to properly throw the rope toy. "I just listen to them. And more importantly, I let them teach me." The documentary won several awards and sparked a global conversation about human-wildlife interaction. Margaret received offers to speak at conferences, to write books, to consult on conservation projects. She declined most of them, choosing to remain at her cabin with her unusual family. But she did agree to one project, a research station established just outside the park, where scientists could study the leopard colony without interfering. The data collected there would eventually revolutionize understanding of animal cognition and social flexibility. One morning, exactly 3 years after Mwezi first appeared, Margaret woke to find him on the porch, but something was different. He was lying very still, and when she approached, she saw that he was injured. Deep claw marks ran along his side, and one of his legs was badly hurt. "Oh, my boy," she breathed, immediately switching into veterinary mode. The wounds suggested a fight with another leopard, probably a territorial dispute, as Mwezi defended his unusual domain. Margaret worked through the morning, cleaning and treating the injuries, administering antibiotics from her emergency supplies. Mwezi endured the treatment with his usual patience, but Margaret could see the pain in his eyes. More concerning was his age. At approximately 4 years old, he was in his prime, but the harsh reality of wild leopard life meant that every fight, every injury, carried the potential for disaster. "You can't keep fighting for this territory," she told him as she worked. "You have Duma now, and the others. You need to share the protection duties." As if understanding, Mwezi made a soft sound of agreement. His recovery was slow but steady. During those weeks, Margaret saw a change in the colony's dynamics. Duma took on more responsibility, patrolling the boundaries, managing disputes among the younger leopards. Kasai became more present, often lying beside Mwezi as he healed. "You've created a legacy," Margaret told him one evening. "This place, this family we've built, it will continue even after we're gone." The thought of after was sobering. Margaret was now 71, and while she was healthy, she was increasingly aware of her mortality. What would happen to the colony when she was gone? Would they scatter? Would they remember? She needn't have worried. 6 months later, Margaret suffered a mild heart attack. She managed to call James before losing consciousness, and woke up in a hospital in the nearest city, 2 hours from her cabin. "The leopards," was the first thing she said when she came to. "They're fine," James assured her. "I've been checking on them daily." "Margaret, you need to listen to me. The doctors say you can't live alone anymore. You need to consider moving closer to medical facilities, maybe even back to the city." Margaret's heart sank. "Leave the cabin? Leave Mwezi and the others? That's not an option," she said firmly. But over the next days, as she recovered, the reality of her situation became clear. She was getting older, frailly. The cabin was remote. If something happened when she was alone, Emma flew in immediately, full of concern and plans. "Mom, you could come live with us in Australia. We have a guest house. You'd be with family." "I'm already with family," Margaret said, thinking of amber eyes and spotted fur. The solution came from an unexpected source. The research station, which had been monitoring the leopard colony, offered to build a small medical outpost near Margaret's cabin, staffed with a nurse and equipped for emergencies. In exchange, Margaret would formally collaborate with their research, allowing more extensive documentation of her interactions with the leopards. "It's not charity," the lead researcher, Dr. Sarah Chun, assured her. "The data we're collecting from your colony is invaluable. You've created something unique in the world, Margaret. We need to preserve it, and that means keeping you healthy and safe." Margaret agreed, and within a month, a small, unobtrusive building had been constructed just down the road from her cabin. The nurse, a young man named Thomas who had specifically requested the posting, was fascinated by the leopards and quickly became integrated into the colony's daily routine. Mwezi, fully recovered from his injuries, seemed to understand that Thomas was there to help Margaret. He would often escort the nurse from the medical post to the cabin, a spotted bodyguard ensuring safe passage. Life settled into a new rhythm. Margaret continued her daily interactions with the leopards, now documented by multiple cameras for scientific study. The data collected was staggering. Evidence of complex communication, cooperative behavior, emotional bonding that transcended species boundaries. One particularly significant discovery came when Sophie, visiting during school holidays, fell and badly scraped her knee. Before any human could react, Duma was there, gently licking the wound clean with the same careful attention Margaret had seen mother leopards give their cubs. "He's providing medical care," Dr. Chen said, reviewing the footage later. "A wild leopard is providing medical care to a human child. This changes everything we thought we knew about interspecies empathy." The colony continued to grow and evolve. Second-generation cubs, born to the leopards who had joined Mwezi and Duma, grew up with human interaction as a normal part of life. They maintained their wild instincts, hunting and establishing territories, but they also understood that humans could be family. Margaret began working with the research station to establish protocols for similar conservation efforts elsewhere. Not the wholesale domestication of wild animals, but the creation of buffer zones where human and animal lives could overlap safely, with mutual benefit. "We're not trying to tame them," she explained to a visiting journalist. "We're learning to coexist, to be neighbors, even family, while respecting each other's nature." On her 73rd birthday, Margaret woke to find her porch crowded with leopards. Mwezi, Duma, Kasai, the grown cubs, and several newer additions were all present, as if they somehow knew this day was special. Emma and her family were visiting, and the children, now teenagers, moved among the leopards with easy familiarity. Lucas was documenting behavior patterns for his advanced placement biology project. Sophie was teaching one of the younger cubs to play with a new toy she brought. The youngest, Ben, now 12, was lying against Mwezi's side, reading a book aloud. "Look at this," Emma said softly, standing beside her mother. "Look at what you've created." Margaret watched her human grandchildren and her leopard family interact with seamless comfort, two species bridging a gap that had existed for millennia. "They created it as much as I did," she said. "That first morning, when Mwezi chose to trust me, he started something neither of us could have imagined." As if hearing his name, Mwezi looked up, those amber eyes finding Margaret's across the crowded porch. The look that passed between them contained 3 years of shared history, of trust built slowly and tested constantly, of a love that transcended the boundaries humans had drawn between wild and tame. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Margaret sat in her favorite chair with Mwezi beside her. The other leopards were scattered around the porch and yard, some sleeping, some playing, all peacefully coexisting in this impossible paradise they'd created together. "You know," she told Mwezi, "scientists keep asking me how this happened. How did we break through millions of years of evolution that should keep us apart? And I never know quite what to tell them." Mwezi rumbled deep in his chest, a sound she'd learned meant contentment. "But I think the answer is simple," she continued. "We both needed family. We both needed love. And love doesn't care about species or science or what's supposed to be impossible." A year later, Margaret's health took another turn. This time, the heart attack was more severe, and even with the medical post nearby, it was clear that her time was becoming limited. From her bed in the cabin, she could see the porch where it all began. The leopards seemed to understand that something was wrong. They took turns keeping vigil, one or two always visible through the window, their presence a constant comfort. Mwezi, now showing the first signs of age himself, rarely left his post by her door. When Thomas needed to provide medical care, Mwezi would move just far enough to allow access, then immediately return to his guardian position. "He knows," Thomas told Dr. Chen. "Somehow, he knows she's dying." Emma and her family moved into the cabin for an extended stay. Margaret's granddaughter Sophie, now 17 and headed to university to study veterinary medicine, spent hours on the porch with the leopards, learning their individual personalities and quirks. They're not pets, Margaret told her one afternoon, her voice weak but determined. Never forget that. They're partners. Equals. That's why this works. Sophie nodded, understanding. I'll remember, Nana. I'll make sure everyone remembers. One morning, Margaret woke to find she could barely move. The inn was close. She could feel it. She asked Thomas and Emma to help her onto the porch one last time. The leopards gathered as if summoned. Mwezi, Duma, Kasai, their cubs, and the extended family that had formed over the years. They arranged themselves around her chair, a spotted honor guard for their matriarch. Margaret's breathing was labored, but she felt at peace. She'd lived to see her experiment become a legacy, her loneliness transformed into the richest of families. Mwezi, she whispered. The great leopard rose and approached, pressing his head gently against her hand. She felt his purr, that impossible sound that had first told her this relationship was different, special, unprecedented. Thank you, she said, for choosing me, for saving me, for showing the world that love has no boundaries. Mwezi made that special sound, the one that meant, I'm here, you there? I'm here, she whispered back. I'll always be here. Margaret Hayes passed away that evening, surrounded by her human family and her leopard colony. The leopards remained with her body through the night, a vigil that was documented by the research cameras and would later move millions when the footage was released. The funeral was unlike anything the region had ever seen. Conservationists, scientists, government officials, and locals all came to pay their respects. But the most remarkable attendees were the leopards. They appeared at the edge of the service, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly present. Mwezi sat at the front of the group, his amber eyes fixed on the proceedings with what could only be described as understanding. When Margaret's body was buried on a hill overlooking the cabin, Mwezi approached the grave. He circled it 3 times, a behavior never documented in leopards, then lay down beside it. He stayed there for 3 days, neither eating nor drinking, before finally returning to the colony. The research station, with Emma's cooperation and Sophie's eventual leadership, continued to monitor and protect the leopard colony. The cabin was preserved as a memorial and research center, a testament to the bridge Margaret had built between 2 worlds. Mwezi lived another 2 years, growing grayer, but never losing his dignity or his role as the colony's elder statesman. He continued to visit the porch every morning, often accompanied by younger leopards to whom he seemed to be passing on the traditions of this unusual family. On his final morning, he made the journey to Margaret's grave one last time. Thomas found him there that evening, having passed away peacefully in his sleep, positioned as if keeping watch over his friend. He was buried beside Margaret, the veterinarian and the leopard who had rewritten the rules of what was possible between human and wild. The colony continued for many years, with new generations of leopards maintaining the traditions Mwezi and Margaret had established. Scientists came from around the world to study this unique population, where leopards had learned that humans could be trusted, could be family. Sophie, following in her grandmother's footsteps, but armed with new understanding, established similar programs across Africa. Not everywhere. The conditions had to be right, the animals willing, the humans committed to respect rather than domination. But slowly, carefully, other colonies emerged. The research from Margaret's colony revolutionized conservation efforts. Instead of strict separation between human and wild spaces, new models emerged that allowed for overlap, for coexistence, for the kind of mutual support that Margaret and Mwezi had pioneered. Lucas wrote a book about his grandmother and the leopards, which became an international bestseller and inspired a new generation of conservationists who understood that sometimes the best way to protect wild animals was not to keep them at a distance, but to invite them into our lives with respect and love. The last direct descendant of Mwezi, a magnificent male with the same amber eyes, lived until 2045. He was the last leopard to have known Margaret personally, though he'd been just a cub when she died. He maintained the morning ritual until the very end, appearing on the porch at dawn, making that special vocalization that had become the colony's signature. By then, the cabin had become a pilgrimage site for wildlife lovers and scientists alike. The porch where it all began was preserved exactly as Margaret had left it, complete with the old rope toy that Mwezi had loved. But the real legacy wasn't in the physical space or even in the scientific breakthroughs. It was in the fundamental shift in how humanity understood its relationship with the wild. Margaret and Mwezi had proven that the boundaries between human and animal, domestic and wild, were far more fluid than anyone had imagined. They'd shown that love, respect, and trust could bridge any gap, overcome any evolutionary divide. In schools around the world, children learned about the veterinarian and the leopard who had chosen each other. They learned that wildlife conservation wasn't just about protection and separation, but about connection and coexistence. The phrase, "I'm here, are you there?" became a global symbol for interspecies communication and cooperation. Wildlife reserves began incorporating Margaret's principles, creating spaces where humans and animals could interact safely and with mutual benefit. But perhaps the most beautiful legacy was the simplest one. In a small cemetery overlooking the African bush, two graves lay side by side. One marked Margaret Hayes, 1952 to 2025, she listened. The other marked Mwezi, 2021 to 2027, he chose. Visitors often reported that at dawn and dusk, when the light was just right, they could see leopards visiting the graves. The leopards would sit quietly for a few moments, as if paying respects, then disappear back into the bush. Whether these were descendants of the original colony or entirely wild leopards drawn by some ineffable connection, no one could say for certain. But everyone who witnessed it understood that Margaret and Mwezi's bond had become something larger than just their individual story. It had become proof that in a world increasingly divided between human and natural spaces, there was another way. A way of mutual respect, unexpected love, and the kind of magic that happens when we stop insisting on boundaries and start building bridges. The final entry in Margaret's journal, found after her death, read, "People ask me if I regret breaking the rules, if I worry that I've done more harm than good by interfering with nature. But they're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether humans should interact with wild animals. The question is how we can do it with respect, love, and recognition of their autonomy." Mwezi never became my pet. He became my teacher, my friend, my family. He showed me that the walls we build between ourselves and the wild are of our own making, and that sometimes, if we're very lucky, an animal will show us how to tear them down. He saved me, in every way a person can be saved. And maybe, just maybe, our story will help save others, human and animal alike. Because in the end, we're all just trying to find our family, our place, our home. And sometimes, home has spots and amber eyes and a purr that shouldn't exist, but does anyway, against all odds and rules and logic. Sometimes, home chooses you. The story of Margaret and Mwezi became more than just a tale of unusual animal behavior. It became a reminder that in a world full of divisions, love and respect could still build bridges. That loneliness could be answered in the most unexpected ways. That family could be found in the most unlikely places. And that sometimes, just sometimes, when a 3-month-old leopard cub appears on your porch at dawn, the best thing to do is listen to what he's trying to tell you. Because he might just be saying, "I'm here. Are you there?" And the answer, always, forever, across species and time and death itself, is yes. I'm here too.